Hello, class. Today we're here to talk about the market for labor. All right, so there is no such a thing as one labor market. As we all know, some people get paid more and some people get paid less. Now, the way we normally treat this in economics, though, is it's still a sort of a supply and demand dynamic. So it's still the amount of money that you get paid still depends on supply and demand. So workers are going to be labor supply. And it makes sense that they're labor supply, and it also makes sense that the labor supply is upward sloping, because what it basically means is that the more you get paid, the more you're going to be willing to work, assuming everything else is constant. In other words, if you look at a supply line is upward sloping. Okay, work on this. Here we go. So on this side, we're going to have quantity of labor. On this side, we're going to have wages, which is the same thing as the cost of labor. And it makes sense for supply to be upward sloping, and it makes sense for supply of labor to be upward sloping. Because what it basically says is that more people are going to be willing to work the higher the wage. So the higher the wage, the more people are willing to work. Now, businesses and the government are going to be labor demand. And it makes sense that the lower the wage, the more they're willing to hire. So it makes sense for labor demand to be downward sloping. Now, demand for labor being downward sloping, what it basically means is that if you look at a particular point on the demand line, and then you look at a different point on the demand line, the higher the quantity that they're willing to hire will be more, the lower the wage. And it makes sense, because if you think about what labor basically is, there are multiple things you have to buy to create a particular product. Now, the price that you're going to charge for a particular product has to do with the cost of the things that you need to buy in order to produce that particular product. A large cost is labor. So basically, the lower the cost of labor, the more quantity of labor companies are willing to hire. Okay? So there are other things that you need to buy. And we talked about, fixed costs, variable costs, etc., etc. But the point is, the labor is a piece of the cost of a particular product. And in order for companies to set a particular price for a product, they need to look at all the costs, and then they gotta add the amount of profit that they want to make, and then you get your price. So it makes sense for the demand for labor to be downward sloping, which basically means that the lower the wage, the more they're willing to hire. It also makes sense for supply of labor to be upward sloping, because if you're the one producing labor, then the higher the quantity of labor is associated with a higher wage. In other words, the more they pay you, the more you're willing to work. And that's same as like when we were talking about supply and demand in previous chapters. That's why you need equilibrium in order to figure out what the real price of something is. Because if it was up to supply in this case, then everybody would get paid $1 million. And if it was up to demand, everybody would get paid, $1 an hour. Okay? So you need supply and demand to figure out equilibrium. Wages and equilibrium quantity. All right. Labor supply. Now, when you're deciding how many hours of work you're going to work, what you basically look is you look at how many hours you have of free time and how many hours you already work. There is an opportunity cost to work. I was supposed to write here how many hours. There you go. So how many hours you have of free time and how many hours you already work. There's an opportunity cost to work, and that is your leisure or free time. And there's an opportunity cost to leisure time, and that is your work time. The more leisure time you have, the more you value work time, and the more work hours you have, the more you value leisure time. So you reach a sort of middle point between work and leisure. Beyond a certain amount of work, you're going to require what we call overtime in order to convince you to work more. Now, another way of thinking about this sort of tug of war between supply and demand of labor. Well, that was a terrible line. Let me get the line shape. Here we go. All right, so imagine we put on this side, we put, let's say we put in here, so these are your 24 hours in a day. Okay? Now imagine that we're deciding how many hours we're going to work and how many hours we're going to have of leisure. Okay? Now, of course, we got to sleep, right? So we're going to take, I don't know, a few hours of that and we're going to sleep. Then we're going to take a few hours of that. We're going to do the chores that we have to do. So we got, I don't know, we got to eat. Okay, got to take a shower, stuff like that. We got to drive to and back from work, etc. All right, and then there's going to be a certain amount of hours that you're going to work. All right, now the idea is, imagine that you have no work time and all you do is sleep and this and watch TV, man, because you got to fill it up with something, the rest of the day. So if you don't work at all, so if you, this line is like all the way over here, then what's going to happen is somebody's going to say, okay, I'll pay you $6 an hour, $8 an hour minimum wage now to work, and then you're probably going to take it because you don't value your free time as much. So if you exchange an hour of work for an hour of free time, you have a lot of free time, so you're willing to do that. Now, this might be true for a while, but there's going to be a time or a point where now you're crossing that threshold of how many hours of work you're willing to work. And then in order for you to work beyond that, they're going to have to offer you a higher wage. All right? So it's always a sort of tug of war between the amount of work that you have and the amount of leisure. And then the more you work, the more you value leisure time because you have less of it. And then the more you have leisure time, the less you value that leisure time. All right? So you keep resetting this line this way or that way. And it's always a sort of exchange between how many hours of work and how many hours of leisure. All right. Now, there are two supply lines. There is a supply line for the individual. And for the individual, we have what we call a backward bending supply line. And what that basically means is that it is true that the more somebody pays you, the more you're willing to work. So if somebody, like right now, let's say you get paid $10 an hour and you work, say, 20 hours a week. Somebody says, hey, I need to work an extra hour. And then they say, I'll pay you an extra $1 per hour every extra hour. Then you'll be like, oh, cool, okay, I'll do it. All right? But there is a point where it doesn't matter what they offer you, you're not going to work anymore. And that's what this point basically is. Okay? So if you look at if you think about this individual point right here, This is the maximum quantity of labor hours as an individual that you're willing to put in. You don't want to work any more than that. All right. The other day, I was analyzing how many hours I work every week, and I ended up with something like 63 hours is how much I'm working every week. And I noticed that I'm getting to this point because I keep getting calls for extra things to do, and I keep saying no to them. So in other words, I gotta, I'm getting client calls to go do this, and more people say, oh, you need you to teach this or this other thing, and I just keep saying, no, I don't, no, I can't, no, I'm busy, no, etc. And then that's what we mean by the individual labor supply. So there is a point, there is a sort of wage or amount of money that you are no longer willing to work anymore beyond that. Now, if for whatever reason somebody wants to pay you more beyond that amount, then what's really going to happen is you work less. So beyond a number, the more and more you get paid, the less and less you actually work. Right? Now, this is not true for a market, or at least we haven't seen it, but it is definitely true for the individual. So you're willing to work more given a higher wage, but up to a certain amount, you are not longer going to be willing to work. You have reached that maximum amount of money that you want to earn, and then anywhere beyond that, you just don't want to. Another way of thinking about that again is if you let me turn this off. So if you go over here and you think about, you kind of like move this line to the right so much that now it's like cutting into your sleeping time. And you'd be like, okay, that's it, I need to sleep. All right. So there's a sort of maximum there. All right. Now, labor supply for the market is upward sloping. The labor supply varies depending on the elasticity. Elasticity depends on whether you are high skill or low skill. And I always have a bit of an issue when I'm talking about this because sometimes something that you consider low skill now can be considered high skill later. It really depends on how many people are doing something like that. But in general, what we like to call low skill labor has very little to do with like hours of how much you study something. It has to do more with like a set of skill that can be easily replaceable by others. In other words, a worker that has skills that are not really valued because most people already have them, or there's a lot of people with those skills, at least at the particular moment in time. Another way of thinking about this is if we go back 200 years, for example, in the 1800s, very few people could read and write. So if you could just read and write, that will put you on a high skill level. As a consequence of that, kings and queens used to hire people who could read and write, and then all you really needed is to read and write. Now, as soon as we started creating 6th grade education standard for everybody, 8th grade education standard for everybody, 12th grade education standard for everybody, and then now all of a sudden everyone knows how to read and write, or pretty much almost everyone knows how to read and write, then reading and writing became low skill. All right, so I want you to think about, again, low skill and high skill as more of a, depending on how many people have that particular skill and whether or not it's valuable at that particular point in time. So this type of market of quote unquote low skill work, it's relatively elastic on its supply line. Now, on the other side, consider somebody like a nurse or a doctor that has to go to school and it has to have the specialized training. Most of those schools are expensive, so not a lot of people want to go there or incur all of those costs to go there. This is what we call high skill work. So a high skill worker is a worker that has a set of skills that are not easily replaceable by others or by training, or the training takes too long for somebody to be able to achieve that particular skill, or they have a talent that other people just don't have. Now, this type of market is usually relatively inelastic in supply. So this is a supply line for low-skilled labor. And remember that elasticity has to do with the shape of the line. So elastic means the line is sort of flatter. If you think about this being like a little mountain, then elastic means it's more like a hill. And inelastic means it's more like a steep mountain. So inelastic labor has a more steep supply line, while elastic labor has a flatter supply line. All right, now let's talk about labor demand. Now, labor demand comes from the businesses or the government that need to hire those people to produce whatever they're interested in producing. Now, labor demand is what we call derived demand. In other words, demand is derived from the demand of the product being produced. So in other words, if there is no demand for the product that you produce, then there will be no demand for the labor for that product. Okay? So demand for labor is what we call derived demand. In other words, you have demand for the production of a product, and as a consequence of that, there is demand for the labor that produces that product. Now, this derived demand concept is important to understand because a lot of the times governments create policies that are misguided to protect industries that don't have demand for their products. And the policies are basically doomed to fail. In the US right now, we have a movement, for example, towards greener technologies, more environmentally friendly technologies. As a consequence of that, these sort of older technologies in many ways are going away. I want you to think about the production of electricity with, say, solar panels versus coal. Now, the government can come in and protect the coal industry as much as they can, but if nobody is building the next coal-fired power plant, or consumers are not buying electricity through coal-fired power plants, then at some point that protection is doomed to fail. Because if you fast forward into the future, there will be no demand for the product that you are protecting. And then if you want to keep protecting the industry, then you have to bail it out again. In other words, the government will have to become the buyer of the product that those people produce. So there is a demand for labor is derived from the demand of the product that labor is producing. I don't know if you've ever experienced this movement of people that basically say, well, I'm not going to buy more of this and I'm not going to buy more of that, and they do it consciously. Out of the top of my head, I'm thinking of somebody who's like a vegetarian, for example, or somebody who is a vegan. And a lot of what they do is not just because they don't want to eat meat, but also they do it for other purposes beyond not just eating meat. They do it because they want to change society. Now, believe it or not, when it's like 3 people doing it, it's not going to make any difference. But if you have 3 people that then convince other 3 people, and then those 3 people convince another 6 people, and then those 6 people and 6 people now convince another 12 people, then eventually it becomes a movement. And as a consequence of that movement, they create change because those people are going to be creating the new demand and therefore the new jobs. And then the older ones will slowly sort of go away. All right? And as I mentioned before, demand is derived demand. So if all of us all of a sudden tomorrow decided we're not going to drink coffee anymore, which I doubt, by the way, it's going to happen, but if all of us decided we're not going to drink coffee anymore, we're going to drink tea, then what's going to happen is everybody producing coffee will have to start producing tea. So there'll be no demand for production of coffee, and then boom, there you go. No production of coffee. Everybody produces tea. Okay? So labor demand is derived. Now let's talk a little bit about how much an employer is willing to pay. For simplicity purposes, every time we use supply and demand of labor, we normally use a single wage to explain a lot of these models. But the reality is that everybody doesn't get paid the same. People get paid different wages. The amount that somebody is willing to pay you depends on the amount of earnings you bring to the company. Because labor is part of the cost of production of a product, and you need to think about the revenue that product is going to bring. All right, so I want you to think about a product that is kind of like low price versus a product that is high price. So think about this as being the price of a product. So a high price product, you can have a high cost to that product. Now out of that cost, you got labor, right? And then other stuff you gotta buy. And then over here you put profit. All right, now I want you to think about a product that is low price. Now, because you still gotta have profit, in other words, remember companies to exist are profit maximizers, something that we've been talking about in this class a lot. Then labor cost becomes a part of it, and other cost becomes the other. All right, now notice the distance here. So imagine that this labor says, oh, I want a higher wage. Then maybe the producer has to be like, okay, I'll pay you more. But imagine this labor says, I want a higher wage. Notice that because I cannot push the price of the product any higher, then it's difficult for this labor to increase their wages. But it's much easier for this labor to increase their wages. Notice also that they can, I don't know, we can squeeze out a little bit of profit so it can increase labor. So the point is that high price products can also carry a higher wage for their workers, while low price products carry lower wages for their workers. So your wage in many ways depends on whether you work in a high price environment, something that costs a lot of money, or you sell something that's kind of premium, or if you work in a sort of low price environment. So the amount an employer is willing to pay you depends on the amount of earnings that you're going to bring to that company. Because labor is part of the cost of production, and a product needs to think about a revenue that it will bring. So somebody standing at a cashier in your local grocery is part of the cost of production. The wage that person receives is part of the cost of delivering groceries. They will get paid a portion of the earnings of that company. Someone like the best basketball player will get paid a portion of the earnings of the team. The best basketball players bring a lot of fans. They sell a lot of tickets. They sell a lot of shirts. They sell a lot of shoes. They have a lot of endorsements. Those endorsements are part of the earnings for the team. Therefore, they receive a larger portion of the earnings. All right. In a very general way, low-skilled labor has low wages, and high-skilled labor has high wages. And that is simply because of the elasticity of the line. So if you work in a low-skill wage environment, you end up with a low wage. And if you have a high-skill wage environment, then you end up with a higher wage. Now, let's have a bit of a conversation about minimum wages. Now, this minimum wage graph is using a basic supply and demand. Now, notice that we could have equilibrium wage at equilibrium. A minimum wage is when the government sets a wage that is higher than equilibrium. It's kind of like, imagine the government says, equilibrium wages is $5, but we want people to get paid more than $5 because $5 is just not enough. Okay, so imagine that equilibrium wages are 5, but then the government says, oh, no, that's just too low. Let's make that number higher, and we make it, say, $8. Now, a minimum wage is a market disruption. It creates a wage that is different from equilibrium in the market. As a consequence of that, you also create either a surplus or a shortage. So when you create a minimum wage, what ends up happening is before quantity, supply, and demand, they were in the same place, but when you pass that minimum wage, the quantity supply and quantity demanded no longer match. So you have a quantity supply that is going to exceed the quantity demanded, and you end up with a market surplus. Now, because this is a labor market, then you end up with a surplus of labor. And a surplus of labor is the same thing as saying unemployment. So unemployment is generated when you have minimum wage laws. Now, minimum wage laws are not the only reason you have unemployment, but it is definitely one of the reasons you have unemployment. Alright, so unemployment is basically a surplus of labor. A surplus of labor is generated when you have there's higher quantity supply of labor than there's quantity demand for labor. Minimum wages tend to generate unemployment in any place where they're established. Increasing minimum wages creates more unemployment because an increase in minimum wages higher and farther away from equilibrium generates a higher surplus and therefore more unemployment. Minimum wages reduce the quantity of labor, increase the quantity supply of labor, and create a market surplus in pretty much every case. And increasing minimum wages makes all of it even worse than before. All right, so I want you to look again at this graph and think about what would happen if I make it go even higher. So what would happen is the surplus before was the difference between this point and this point. That was a surplus before, and the surplus now is going to be all of that. So the higher you move a minimum wage, the more the difference between quantity supply and quantity demanded of labor. Now to wrap it up though, let's have a conversation about should we get rid of minimum wages then? Well, this is a little difficult to answer. The reason we have minimum wages is because minimum wages are created by the government so that minimum wage workers can earn a living wage. Therefore, minimum wages are related usually to the cost of living in a particular area. Areas with higher minimum wages in general have a higher cost of living, and areas with lower minimum wages have a lower cost of living. I want to show you real quick, by the way, the minimum wages all over the United States so you understand that it's not standardized. All right, so I found this website that has all these different minimum wages all over the U.S. Now, the federal minimum wage, last time I checked, is $7.25. So that's the lowest wages can be in the U.S. Your state can have a higher minimum wage than that number, and that's kind of like how it works. So the federal government creates the bottom wage all over the United States. Then your state can have a different wage, and then some cities can have their own wages. Some counties can have their own wages as long as they're higher than the previous one. So, for example, if you go to Alaska, minimum wage is 10. If you go to Arizona, it's 12. If you go to California, it's 13. If you go to Delaware, it's 9.25. In Florida, it's 8.56. If you go to Idaho, it's only 7.25. But if you go to Illinois, it's 9.25. If you go to all these states, it's only 7.25. But if you go to Massachusetts, it's 12.75. If you go to Montana, it's 8.65. If you go to New York, it's 11.80. If you go to North Carolina, North Dakota, and the Northern Mariana Islands, it's 7.25. If you go to South Dakota, it's 9.30. If you go to the Virgin Islands, it's 10.50. Okay? So notice that minimum wages vary all over the nation. Now, in a generalized way, we can say that places with a higher minimum wage has a higher cost of living, and places with a lower minimum wage have a lower cost of living. Now, what would happen if you get rid of minimum wage? Now, in a basic way, what would happen is you remove that restriction and wages are going to come back down to equilibrium. This is going to create, though, problems in society because those people are now going to get paid less than they did before. Now, yes, more people are going to have jobs because when you remove that minimum wage, the quantity demanded of work is going to increase, but those people are going to get paid less than before. So because sometimes what they earn might not be enough to live in a particular area, because pretty much every county and city also has welfare programs. Eliminating minimum wages is going to move people from receiving money from the business into receiving money from the government. So it's going to shift the cost of maintaining a living standard for those people from the company to the government and therefore the taxpayer. All right. Now, this is probably, by the way, a debate that you can have actively with other classes and so on, whether you need to increase minimum wages, get rid of minimum wages, or maintain minimum wages. But in general, this is the problem. If we get rid of them, yes, there will be higher quantity demanded, but there will also be more people on welfare. And maybe the end result will be more cost to the taxpayer versus before. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this PowerPoint on the labor market by Professor Choi, and have a good one.